Long before charts, economic models, or academic textbooks existed, one man recognized a truth that many modern systems still refuse to confront. Wealth does not rise in a straight line, power does not accumulate endlessly, and prosperity, when left unchecked, carries within it the seeds of its own decline. This was not an abstract theory developed in isolation. It was a pattern observed directly in the real world by someone who had witnessed society's rise, peak, and decay from the inside. Welcome to Asterisk, the financial historian Asterisk, where money, power, and history collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it appears. In the 14th century, while Europe struggled under the weight of plague, war, and political fragmentation, a North African thinker quietly produced one of the most penetrating analyses of economic and political cycles ever written. His name was Ibn Khaldun, centuries before Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes, or modern macroeconomics. He explained why economies expand, why states grow powerful, and why they eventually collapse under their own weight. Ibn Khaldun was born in 1332 in what is now Tunisia, into a world defined by instability. Dynasties rose and fell with alarming speed. Cities prospered and emptied just as quickly. Disease swept through populations without mercy. Power shifted constantly between rulers, tribes, and factions. This was not an environment suited for comfortable theorizing. It was a world of chaos, and that chaos became his laboratory. Unlike many later economists, Ibn Khaldun was not detached from power. He served in royal courts, advised rulers, negotiated political crises, and observed governance at its most vulnerable moments. He watched governments mismanage wealth, overburden their populations with taxes, lose legitimacy, and then express disbelief when their systems unraveled. Over time, a disturbing realization emerged. The same story repeated itself again and again. Different rulers, different cultures, different beliefs, but the same unmistakable arc of rise, excess, and decline. What Ibn Khaldun understood, and what still separates his thinking from much of modern economics, is that economic systems are not mechanical structures. They are living social organisms. They breathe through trust, coordination, and shared purpose. When those elements strengthen, societies expand. When they weaken, decline begins, even if surface-level prosperity still appears intact. He observed that no dynasty, state, or economy grows indefinitely. Expansion creates order, order creates comfort, and comfort slowly erodes the discipline that made expansion possible. This process is not sudden. It unfolds quietly, often unnoticed by those living inside it. Stability creates the illusion of permanence. Success convinces societies that the conditions which produced it no longer matter. Ibn Khaldun rejected the idea that collapse comes from external shocks alone. Invasions, disasters, and crises may accelerate decline, but they rarely initiate it. The real damage begins internally, long before any visible breakdown occurs. Power becomes concentrated, responsibility becomes diluted, rewards drift away from contribution. The system continues to function, but its foundations weaken. This cyclical pattern repeated itself across cultures, religions, and political systems. Ibn Khaldun saw it in tribal confederations, royal dynasties, city-states, and empires. The names changed, the banners changed, the beliefs changed. The pattern did not. Growth produced strength. Strength produced excess. Excess produced fragility. Crucially, he did not frame this as moral failure. Societies did not decline because people suddenly became evil or incompetent. They declined because incentives shifted. When survival is no longer immediate, priorities change. Risk avoidance replaces innovation. Preservation replaces creation. Extraction becomes easier than productivity. This insight remains deeply uncomfortable today because it challenges a core modern belief that progress is linear. Ibn Khaldun showed that progress is conditional. It depends not on intelligence or technology, but on whether social and economic incentives continue to reward contribution rather than position. When that balance breaks, decline becomes a matter of time, not chance. At the center of Ibn Khaldun's entire framework was a concept he called asterisk, asabiya, asterisk. The word is often translated as social cohesion, but that translation barely captures its economic weight. Asabiya is not merely cultural unity or shared identity. It is the invisible force that allows people to cooperate, trust one another, and act in ways that benefit the group over the short-term interest of the individual. In economic terms, asabiya is the true foundation of productivity. Societies with strong cohesion are capable of building wealth even when resources are scarce. People work harder because effort is respected. They invest because rewards feel attainable. They defend institutions because those institutions feel legitimate. Order emerges not primarily from force, but from shared belief in the system itself. Ibn Khaldun observed that early-stage societies possessed high levels of cohesion. Whether tribal groups or newly formed states, survival required cooperation. Roles were clear. Authority was personal and accountable. Contribution mattered more than status. Under these conditions, productivity flourished. Wealth followed naturally, not because the society was wealthy to begin with, but because its structure allowed effort to compound. Crucially, he understood that cohesion was not permanent. It weakened as societies grew richer and more complex. As distance increased between rulers and the productive population, shared sacrifice declined. Elites became insulated. Rules that once applied equally began to bend. Trust slowly eroded, not through dramatic betrayal, but through accumulation of small exceptions. When cohesion weakened, enforcement replaced cooperation. The state relied more on authority and less on legitimacy. Productivity declined because people no longer felt connected to outcomes. The system still functioned, but at a higher cost and lower efficiency. For Ibn Khaldun, wealth was not the cause of cohesion. Cohesion was the cause of wealth. When that order reversed, decline became inevitable, even if material prosperity appeared to continue for a time. Ibn Khaldun observed that prosperity does not merely change material conditions, it changes behavior. The very success that strengthens a society in its early stages begins to alter the incentives that once sustained it. This transformation is gradual and often invisible to those living through it, which makes it especially dangerous. In the early phase of a state, necessity enforces discipline. Leaders remain close to the productive population. Authority is restrained by accountability. Positions are earned through competence and loyalty. Under these conditions, effort is rewarded and social cohesion remains strong. Wealth grows as a consequence of participation, not privilege. As prosperity accumulates, that relationship begins to weaken. Comfort reduces urgency. Survival is no longer a shared concern. Elites distance themselves from the economic base that supports them. Administrative and military positions become inherited rather than earned. Status begins to outweigh contribution. The system still functions, but its incentives shift quietly. Ibn Khaldun emphasized that this process is not driven by moral decay or personal failure. It is structural. When risk diminishes, behavior adapts. Innovation slows because preservation feels safer than experimentation. Productivity declines because extraction becomes easier than creation. The state increasingly relies on its past success rather than present effort. Over time, wealth concentrates at the top, while the productive base feels disconnected from outcomes. People continue to comply, but they disengage internally. Work becomes obligation rather than opportunity. Loyalty becomes conditional. The discipline that once built the system softens into routine. This is the critical moment Ibn Khaldun identified. Decline does not begin with collapse. It begins when incentives stop rewarding contribution and start protecting position. From the outside, the society appears stable, even powerful. From the inside, cohesion weakens. Comfort replaces purpose, and the system begins living off momentum rather than vitality. Once this shift occurs, decline becomes extremely difficult to reverse, because the behaviors that created wealth no longer feel necessary to those who benefit most from the system. One of Ibn Khaldun's most precise and enduring insights concerned taxation. He observed that the relationship between tax rates and state revenue was not linear, and that misunderstanding this relationship played a central role in the decline of states. Early in a state's life, taxation was low. Rulers required revenue, but they also understood that excessive burden discouraged effort. As a result, people worked, traded, and invested willingly. Economic activity expanded, and total revenue increased despite modest rates. As the state matured, its needs grew. Courts expanded, armies professionalized, administrative layers multiplied. To finance this complexity, rulers raised taxes. Initially, revenue continued to rise, reinforcing the belief that higher extraction was sustainable. But beneath the surface, incentives were already shifting. Productivity slowed, risk-taking declined. Informal activity increased as people sought ways to avoid growing burdens. Eventually, higher taxes produced the opposite effect. People worked less because rewards no longer justified effort. Trade contracted, investment declined. The tax base itself began to shrink. Faced with falling revenue, the state responded in the most predictable way possible. Taxes were raised again. Each increase accelerated economic contraction, deepening the very problem it was meant to solve. Ibn Khaldun made a crucial distinction. States do not fail because they tax too little. They fail because they attempt to extract too much from a declining economy. Revenue collapses not from weakness, but from overreach. The source of wealth is exhausted by the mechanisms designed to sustain power. He did not argue that low taxes were virtuous or high taxes immoral. His argument was structural. Incentives determine behavior. When effort is punished rather than rewarded, participation declines. When extraction outpaces regeneration, the system undermines itself. This dynamic explains why states often appear strongest shortly before fiscal breakdown. Authority increases, enforcement expands. Yet, the economic foundation continues to erode. The state spends more to obtain less, trapped in a cycle of diminishing returns created by its own policies. If Ibn Khaldun were alive today, he would not be impressed by technology, financial innovation, or the complexity of modern markets. He would look past the screens, the data, and the language, and focus on what he always considered decisive: incentives, cohesion, and power. What he would see would feel familiar rather than revolutionary. Modern economies often believe they have escaped history. Progress is treated as linear, permanent, and cumulative. Better data, better policy tools, and more sophisticated institutions are assumed to have solved the problem of instability. Yet, Ibn Khaldun's framework cuts directly through this confidence. The cycle does not disappear as systems grow more advanced, it accelerates. In the modern world, social cohesion still exists, but it is abstracted. It appears as trust in institutions, confidence in currencies, belief in rules, and willingness to participate in large impersonal systems. When these elements are strong, economies expand, investment feels rational, long-term planning makes sense. When they weaken, behavior shifts rapidly toward short-term extraction and risk avoidance. Debt and monetary expansion now serve functions that taxation once did alone. They allow states to maintain scale and stability without immediately confronting declining productivity. For a time, confidence holds. Markets absorb pressure. Growth appears intact, but the underlying dynamic remains unchanged. Future output is consumed to support present structures. Ibn Khaldun would recognize this phase immediately. It is the stage where systems feel most stable and most fragile at the same time. Complexity outpaces coordination. Appearances are preserved while foundations erode. Decline has not arrived, but its conditions are firmly in place. For the individual, this perspective offers clarity rather than fear. Understanding cycles does not grant immunity, but it removes surprise. You stop mistaking peaks for permanence. You recognize when incentives are shifting before prices fully respond. Real financial awareness begins not with prediction, but with humility. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because incentives remain consistent. Ibn Khaldun made that visible centuries ago. And once something is visible, it loses its power to deceive.